The Pemberton estate rose from the edge of the town like something out of a fevered dream, a house too heavy with shadow to ever feel as if it truly belonged to the living. Its silhouette dominated the horizon, a sprawling Gothic structure crowned with jagged turrets that clawed at the sky, as if the house itself were trying to hold back the daylight. People said the windows had a habit of following you, and though no panes of glass could move, every villager swore that when they passed, they felt its eyes upon them. Children dared one another to walk the path up to its rusting iron gates, and some did, but they never lingered. The silence surrounding the estate was suffocating, as though the earth itself recoiled from it. The Pembertons had lived there for as long as the town could remember, though no one could ever quite agree when they first appeared. The older records, the ones browned with age and dust, spoke of a great house erected by a family of uncommon wealth. Yet the dates... Sorry for the interruption. Drop a quick comment with your city or country. I'd be happy to know where you're watching from. We're contradictory, bleeding across centuries. In one telling, the estate was built in 1760. In another, it already stood in 1693. The masons and carpenters who might have built it left no trace of their work in the town's history. The estate, it seemed, had always been there, rising from the marshland like some ancient, immovable monument. To approach the house was to feel the world subtly shift. The air grew colder as though the sunlight dimmed the closer one came to its doors. The path, overgrown with black ivy, forced visitors into a single line, funneling them toward the mouth of the estate as if it were swallowing them whole, and the windows, always the windows, loomed overhead. Long arched, their glass blackened by decades of soot and storm, they caught no reflection of the sky. Instead, they seemed to hold their own depth, a darkness that hinted at movement within. Villagers muttered that those who stared too long into those windows sometimes swore they saw faces, pale and shifting, watching from behind the glass. The stories passed from mouth to mouth painted the Pembertons not as ordinary folk but as figures of unease, too insular, too reserved, too strange. They were seen in town rarely and always in pairs, never alone. When they spoke in riddles, in names that never matched from one introduction to the next. One might meet a Thomas Pemberton at the market and then, a year later, be introduced to the very same man as Richard. What unsettled the townsfolk most was not the inconsistency itself, but how natural it seemed to the family, as though the shifting of names was not deceit, but simple truth. The estate held all of this within its bones. The spires, the gargoyles, the crooked chimneys, all were part of a single, brooding presence that grew heavier with each passing year. And as the town changed, wooden storefronts replaced by brick, gas lamps giving way to electric, the Pemberton estate remained untouched. Time seemed not to move there. Moss thickened along its walls, ivy sank its roots deeper, and the windows only grew darker, their watch over the town unbroken. Those who lived closest to the estate swore they could hear sounds at night. Not of footsteps or doors creaking, but of something older, something like whispers bleeding into the wind. They said that when the moon was at its thinnest, voices rolled down the hillside, mingling with the rustling of the trees. If you stood in the right place, you could hear your own name spoken back to you, though never in a voice you recognized. Few tested the legend, and those who did rarely spoke of it after. To call the Pemberton estate a house was a disservice. It was a monument, a tomb, and a sentinel all at once. It held its place on the hill not as a dwelling, but as a proclamation, a reminder that whatever the Pembertons were, they were not bound by the same rules as the rest of the town. The windows did not simply watch, they recorded, they remembered. And as generations rose and fell in the village below, the house and the family within seemed untouched, waiting, as if time itself bowed to the Pembertons. The townspeople often whispered that the Pembertons were never truly born into Grafton Hollow, but rather that the house had created them. The estate perched high upon the ridge seemed older than the town itself, its blackened stonework slick with centuries of rain and soot. When the family appeared in the mid-1800s, no one could quite recall the carriage that had brought them, nor from which direction it had come. One day the sprawling manor was empty. The next, its long windows glowed faintly with candlelight, as though the house had exhaled after years of slumber. The patriarch, a tall and cadaverous man who insisted he be called father without further name, was the first to appear in town. His voice was precise but curiously hollow, and he purchased supplies with coins so tarnished they seemed relics from another century. The merchant, trembling, noticed the coins bore no familiar monarch, only a crest resembling a coiled serpent devouring its own tail. That evening, when asked his surname, father only smiled thinly. "Names," he said, "are burdens we do not carry." Soon after, the rest of the family emerged. A woman with a veil perpetually draped over her face, who spoke in soft, lilting tones but never raised her eyes. Children, 3 or perhaps 4 for their numbers seemed to shift in local memory, stood silently behind her, pale as porcelain dolls. They too refused to offer names. Instead, they introduced themselves with phrases: the eldest, the quiet one, the watcher. The villagers, unsettled, accepted these evasions, though the church register remained blank for each Pemberton entry. Their isolation grew infamous. Rarely did anyone approach the estate, for the iron gates were guarded by stone hounds whose eyes gleamed wet in the moonlight, though no rain had fallen. At night, townsfolk claimed to see silhouettes, pacing behind the windows, elongated and distorted as if the glass warped flesh into shadow. Most chilling of all, it was said that when the Pembertons spoke among themselves, their voices carried down into the town, not as words, but as murmurs layered over each other, like a choir rehearsing a hymn in reverse. What unsettled the villagers most was not merely what the Pembertons concealed, but how their secrecy seemed contagious. Shopkeepers could not recall what goods the family purchased. The blacksmith forgot whether father had ordered hinges or chains, and children sent to spy on the manor returned with eyes glazed, muttering that the windows had whispered to them. The Pembertons' refusal to speak their true names was not merely eccentricity. It was doctrine. Names, father claimed when pressed, tied souls to a ledger the family did not recognize. "We are unbound," he murmured once, his voice like smoke curling from an extinguished candle. Those who heard him felt both horror and envy, for there was weight in his words, as if he had glimpsed freedom from a debt all others were still paying. As years passed, the Pembertons became less a family than a specter that loomed over Grafton Hollow. The manor's windows, with their glistening panes, reflected not light but movement, as though something unseen pressed against the glass from within. Travelers reported that while walking past at dusk, they could feel eyes trailing them until the last stone of the estate slipped from view. Mothers began to hush their children with warnings: "Misbehave," and the Pembertons would watch you through your bedroom window. But to the villagers' disquiet, the Pembertons were not always confined to their estate. On certain moonless nights, figures cloaked in black would descend into town. They moved soundlessly through the cobbled streets, entering shops that should have been locked. In the morning, doors stood ajar, candles burned to stubs, and yet nothing was stolen, at least nothing tangible. Instead, people complained of gaps in memory, as though entire hours of their lives had been neatly removed. One baker swore he awoke in his own bed with flour still clinging to his hands, unable to recall baking a dozen loaves that now sat cooling on the windowsill. It was then the rumor took hold that the Pembertons fed not on food but on memory, and that to offer them your true name was to surrender your history entirely. Those who had spoken too freely with the family began to fade in odd ways. A seamstress forgot how to thread a needle, though she had stitched for 30 years. A widower could no longer remember the face of his late wife, only the echo of her laughter. When asked, he shivered, and said the sound reminded him of the children at the estate. The town minister attempted to intervene. One autumn evening, he climbed the ridge with a Bible clutched to his chest and demanded entry. He returned the next morning, but his hair, once black, had turned white as frost. He resigned that week, muttering of names written backward, and a ledger with no God to keep it. Fear bound the town in silence. The Pembertons had become both curse and covenant, an unseen pact that no one acknowledged aloud, but everyone obeyed. They avoided the ridge. They ignored the manors, windows, and above all, they never asked the family who they were, for in Grafton Hollow, names had become dangerous currency, and the Pembertons held the only wealth that mattered. And still, the estate loomed, windows gleaming, as if watching, as if waiting for the day when every name in town would be spoken, one by one, into its waiting halls. The town of Ashwick had always known the Pembertons to be private, but in the early 1800s their silence began to shift from eccentricity to something more unsettling. The family's refusal to speak their true names was first noticed during church services. Parish records listed them as Jonathan, Elizabeth, and Mary, yet none of the townsfolk ever heard those names pass between their lips. Instead, they addressed one another in odd, clipped titles: brother, mother, daughter. Even in public, this practice never wavered. It might have been dismissed as mere affectation, but when the Reverend attempted to correct the youngest child at communion, calling her Mary Pemberton in full, she recoiled so violently she spilled the chalice. Witnesses recalled her pale face drained of color, as though the utterance had dragged something unseen into the room. From that day on, the townspeople whispered that the family carried a secret curse bound to their names. Inside the estate, according to later testimony from a servant, the prohibition was absolute. Speaking a true name resulted in immediate punishment: isolation in the cellar, fasting, or days spent in silence. The servants themselves were instructed never to say the names aloud, and more than one maid quit after being struck for forgetting. One former governess later told a magistrate that she once tried to soothe the young girl by whispering her real name in comfort, only for the child to scream in terror, begging her never to do it again. Rumors thickened. Some claimed that the Pembertons had discovered their lineage carried an ancestral debt, that their true names tethered them to demons or specters eager to claim them. Others suggested a more human scandal, that the names themselves were false, and the family sought to hide their bloodline's disgrace. Whatever the truth, their silence grew into a wall higher than the estate gates. By 1834, the Pembertons had ceased attending church altogether, preferring their own private ceremonies conducted at night. Townsfolk walking past the estate swore they heard chanting, though no words could be discerned. It was like listening to water run backward, one man said, a sound that wanted to be language but wasn't. And still, the windows of the house seemed to watch, as though the estate itself had taken on the burden of speaking for them. By the mid-19th century, the Pemberton estate had developed a reputation that both repelled and fascinated the townsfolk. Children dared one another to touch the iron gates at dusk, running back breathless and shrieking with laughter. Adults, however, walked the long way around rather than pass beneath its looming shadow. The family's gatherings, visible only in fleeting glimpses through the tall windows, were the subject of endless speculation. On certain nights, a soft golden glow would suffuse the entire east wing, shadows pacing deliberately against the drapes. Sometimes a dozen figures could be seen seated in a circle, unmoving for hours. Other times only a single silhouette loomed, head bent as though listening to something just beyond the glass. The housekeeper of a neighboring property once described hearing what she thought was laughter carried on the wind from the Pemberton estate. Yet it was not the laughter of mirth. It sounded hollow, she later said, as though their joy had been carved out and replaced with something mechanical. Within the town, speculation about the family's silence hardened into belief. People insisted that to speak a Pemberton's true name was to invite calamity. An apothecary told of a delivery boy who dared to call out Jonathan at the gates, only to be bedridden with fever the following day. Though he recovered, the story circulated until no one dared utter the names again. The townsfolk instead mirrored the family, referring to them as the father, the mother, the girl. It was during this period that the estate became more fortress than home. Servants dwindled to a handful, and those who remained were rarely seen outside the walls. Deliveries were left at the gate and retrieved under the cover of darkness. The Pembertons themselves were glimpsed only fleetingly, in heavy cloaks or veils, moving as if the air itself might betray them. But the silence, while impenetrable, was not empty. From the estate came noises that stirred dread: the dragging of furniture across unseen rooms, the faint echo of chanting, the rustle of pages turned by hands no one could see. The townsfolk whispered that the family had made a covenant with forces unnamed, and that their voices were the price. By 1850, Ashwick lived in uneasy coexistence with the Pembertons. The townspeople tolerated the looming house at the edge of their fields just as one tolerates a storm that never quite breaks. Yet the truth was simpler and darker. The family's secrecy had succeeded. No one spoke their true names anymore, not the servants, not the townsfolk, not even themselves. And in that silence, the Pembertons thrived, as though feeding on the fear that had now become as permanent a fixture in Ashwick as the estate's watchful windows. There is no clock in the Pemberton estate that keeps proper time. Every one of them, grandfather clocks, mantel clocks, delicate silver watches, ticks out of rhythm, their hands sliding forward or back as though resisting order. Guests found it disorienting. Some swore an entire day had passed when only hours had slipped by, while others claimed dusk fell within minutes of sunrise. The servants learned to ignore them. They rose when the sun crept over the mountains and retired when the lamps burned low. But within the house itself, time bent like heated glass. The Pembertons seemed untouched by it. Their faces remained ageless for unnerving stretches, their skin refusing the wrinkles of time. Generations passed in town, and yet the Pembertons looked almost unchanged, an eerie consistency, as though they existed in a different current. Visitors sometimes described losing hours within the estate. They would step into the library, read, by candlelight, and emerge to find not an evening gone, but 3 days. One young scholar, invited to study the Pembertons' private collection, vanished for a fortnight. When he reappeared at his family's door, his hair had gone white, his eyes clouded, and he muttered of corridors that stretched into years. He never returned to his work, nor spoke of what he had seen. The clocks themselves became a source of fascination. Some were carved with intricate patterns, circles within circles, spirals etched so finely they seemed to move when viewed too long. Others bore inscriptions in forgotten languages, letters that shimmered in lamplight and vanished. In the dark, when they struck the hour, it was never in unison. Instead, a cacophony rolled through the estate as though time were tearing itself into pieces, each moment colliding with the next. Locals whispered that the Pembertons had bargained with time, though no one dared to ask what they had traded for such a privilege. Children, perhaps, or souls, perhaps even their names. Whatever the cost, the evidence was there in their eyes, too sharp, too aware, as though they had lived not once but many times over. And on certain nights, when the moon hung swollen and red, the clocks would stop altogether. The house would fall silent, every tick swallowed by a suffocating stillness. Those who dwelled within claimed it was then the walls themselves seemed to pulse, and the Pembertons would gather, waiting for something. Waiting, as if for a visitor who came only when time itself ceased to move. No clock in the town dared strike midnight when the estate refused it, for when the Pembertons held time in their grasp, the rest of the valley bent to their will. The town of Greyhaven had long since accepted the Pembertons as a necessary evil, like the fog that rolled in from the marshes or the iron trains that howled through the valley at midnight. Yet acceptance never bred comfort. On certain nights when the sky sagged heavy with rain and the streets ran slick with shadows, the townspeople claimed the Pemberton windows glowed faintly, even when no candle or lamp could be seen within. The light was not warm but pale, like the faint reflection of a lantern on bone. Children whispered that the family used mirrors to capture souls, trapping their reflections to keep their enemies silent forever. The adults laughed nervously at such stories, but even they crossed the street, rather than walk directly in front of the estate walls. Horses shied away from the gates, refusing to step closer, as though they too recognized something unnatural emanating from the stone. The silence was the most disturbing. Birds never nested on the roof. No dogs barked within. Only once had a group of boys dared to throw stones at the shutters, and though the rock struck true, no sound echoed back, as if the house itself had absorbed the noise. It was this uncanny quiet that convinced the townsfolk the Pembertons were not like other people, and yet they lived among them. Elias Pemberton attended the quarterly council meetings, though he seldom spoke. The younger members of the clan appeared at markets or on rare church days, their eyes sharp, their mouths silent. They bought flour, ink, or leather, always in exact amounts, never bargaining, never asking questions. Their silence weighed heavier than words, and soon merchants learned to serve them quickly and avert their eyes. It was the silence, too, that gave birth to rumors of their true names. For it was said that when a Pemberton finally did speak, what they uttered was never quite right. Their voices, rarely heard, sounded strained, like an actor learning lines in a foreign tongue. People swore they mispronounced common words, that their accents shifted without reason, that sometimes they paused as though listening to something distant before speaking again. And thus, the town decided they must be hiding something fundamental. A name, after all, is more than a label. It is a tether to the world, a root in the soil of identity. If the Pembertons never spoke theirs, then perhaps they were unmoored. Perhaps their names were too dangerous, or too powerful, or not their own at all. Whatever the reason, the secret grew into a kind of poison in the collective imagination of Greyhaven. The family's silence was no longer peculiar, it was sinister. The whispers spread from tavern to alleyway until they became as constant as the tolling of the church bell. The Pembertons had names they dared not speak. The Pembertons were not who they claimed to be. The Pembertons were shadows, masquerading as flesh. And in the stillness of the night, as the windows glowed faintly like watchful eyes, the town believed every word of it. One autumn evening, when the harvest moon hung swollen and red over Greyhaven, a boy named Samuel Dare vanished on the road nearest the Pemberton estate. He had been sent to deliver a sack of grain to a neighboring farm and never arrived. By dawn, his cart was discovered abandoned by the gates, the horse still tethered, its eyes rolling with fear. The boy himself was gone, leaving only a shoe, caught in the ruts of the path. The town erupted in panic, and though no proof linked the family to Samuel's disappearance, every whisper, every rumor, every half-told story pointed squarely at the Pembertons. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers muttered of curses and bargains made in the dark. Some claimed to see shadows moving across the estate windows long after the lamps in town had gone out. Others swore they heard faint laughter, riding on the wind from the Pemberton grounds, though no feast was known to be held within. When a delegation of townsfolk finally mustered the courage to knock at the heavy oak doors, they were met not with explanation, but with silence. Elias Pemberton himself answered, his face pale, his eyes weary, his hands folded like a priest at confession. He listened to their accusations without interruption, then simply shook his head. He offered neither denial nor defense, only a cold courtesy that left the men unnerved. When they pressed harder, he said, "We speak only what is ours to speak," and shut the door in their faces. The phrase spread like fire through dry brush. What did it mean, to speak only what is theirs to speak? Did it imply secrets, oaths, or some forbidden pact? By week's end, every hearth in Greyhaven burned with theories. Some insisted the Pembertons had stolen the boy to serve as a tongue, a living vessel to utter the words they could not. Others claimed he had been taken into the walls of the house itself, absorbed into the silence like the stones once thrown by children. The search parties scoured the marshes, the woods, even the cellars of nearby farms, but Samuel was never found. His name joined the growing litany of misfortunes tied to the family, a ghostly tally scratched into the town's memory. And though no one dared openly accuse the Pembertons again, from that day forward, every missing chicken, every vanishing trinket, every echoing sound that had no source was laid at their feet. The estate grew more isolated with each passing season. No carolers sang at their gates during Christmastide. No invitations were sent or received. The road past their land grew quiet, used only when necessary. Yet the silence of the house remained constant, unbroken, oppressive. And within that silence, the people of Greyhaven felt the weight of something waiting, something patient, something hidden behind names never spoken aloud. The town of Blackwood whispered about the attic of the Pemberton estate with the same hushed reverence reserved for graveyards. Children dared each other to climb its ivy-coated walls, to peer into the gabled windows where moth-eaten curtains swayed without breeze. The adults, however, averted their eyes when they passed, as if acknowledging the attic would summon something down from its shadowed rafters. No one truly knew what lingered above the Pembertons' heads, but everyone agreed it was not empty. The attic was not a mere storage space for trunks and discarded portraits. It had been built taller, narrower than one might expect, its pitched roof stretching upward like a finger clawing at the sky. Inside, time had settled thick as dust. When a curious maid once entered, she found dozens of portraits stacked against the walls, each of them depictions of the same faces, pale children, sharp-cheeked women, hollow-eyed men. Yet the strangest detail was the eyes. Every painted gaze had been scratched, smeared, or cut away with precision, leaving only gaping voids where their souls should have been. That maid never spoke of what else she saw, only that she left within minutes, her face drained of color. By morning, her trunk was gone from the servants' quarters, and no one in town ever claimed to see her again. The Pembertons themselves rarely mentioned the attic. Guests who inquired were told with polite smiles that the upper rooms were unfit for comfort or full of drafts. Still, one could not ignore the faint creaks that groaned through the rafters long after the household had gone to bed, nor could one explain the glow sometimes visible through the thin attic windows, an amber flicker, like candlelight, that never cast shadows upon the lawn. When the children of Blackwood played near the estate, they swore they saw figures pass across the attic panes. The shapes did not move like people, but in stiff, jerking motions as if animated by invisible strings. Parents dismissed these tales as childish fancies, yet the children all described the same sight, a tall figure and a smaller one, standing, side by side, watching, always watching. And so the attic became legend. No one went there without reason. Those who did were seldom seen again, or returned with a silence in their eyes, as if some part of them had been left behind beneath its rafters. The attic was not a room. It was a repository of the family's darkest truths, a chamber where the unspoken names of the Pembertons seemed to hang heavy in the air, waiting for the wrong mouth to utter them aloud. The village church, with its crooked steeple and cracked bell, stood as the only building in Blackwood older than the Pemberton estate. Its stone walls bore centuries of lichen, and its graveyard spilled outward in uneven rows of crumbling headstones. For most townsfolk, it was a place of solace. For the Pembertons, it was something else entirely, a place of negotiation. The family never attended service with the rest of the villagers. Instead, they came at dusk when the pews were empty and the priest had gone home. Lanterns in hand, they would slip into the nave like phantoms, their black coats whispering across the flagstones. Records in the church's ledgers noted these visits with a single phrase, private rites. What those rites entailed was left unwritten. Some nights villagers passing by heard the organ groaning to life, though no organist had been hired in years. The melody that seeped into the night air was never hymnal. It was discordant, feverish, like bones rattling in sequence. Other nights, the church bell tolled at midnight. Though the rope hung untouched, it was not only the sounds that disturbed the villagers. Certain graves near the Pemberton crypt appeared freshly disturbed, earth loose and sodden though no burial had been recorded. One boy claimed to have seen a figure kneeling over a grave, whispering into the soil as if expecting an answer. By dawn, the boy had lost his voice and did not regain it for months. The priest, Father Hallow, was once questioned about the family's nocturnal habits. His reply was curt, his eyes lowered. The Pembertons honor their own saints. He refused to elaborate. Shortly after, he was found collapsed at the altar steps, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. He lived, but never spoke again. Whispers grew among the villagers that the Pembertons' true church lay not in heaven, but in the space between graves and shadows. The family seemed to commune not with the divine, but with the forgotten, with names that had been carved off stones and records alike. Those names were never repeated aloud in town. They were said to burn the tongue like iron. Over time, the churchyard itself grew hostile. Flowers placed on graves withered overnight. Candles refused to stay lit. Visitors swore they heard muttering from beneath the soil, a low chorus rising from earth that did not want to be still. And at the center of it all, the Pemberton crypt loomed, its iron gate chained shut, its marble face unmarked by name or epitaph. The villagers avoided the church after sunset, but the Pembertons continued their visits undeterred. They did not kneel. They did not pray. They only stood in silence, heads bowed, lips moving faintly, as if repeating names not meant for the living ear. The church, once sacred, became an extension of their estate, another place where the line between the foe, seen in the unspeakable, blurred. It was not God they sought within those stone walls, but remembrance of what should have remained buried. The Pemberton vault lay half-sunken into the northern slope of the family cemetery, a mausoleum of cracked limestone, its doors corroded by time and salt air. It was not the sort of resting place that inspired reverence, but rather an unease that curled low in the stomach. To passers-by, it was said the entrance sighed with every shift of the wind, as though some restless breath pressed against the seams of the rusted iron. No one in town liked to speak of it, though everyone knew it. Children dared each other to touch its handle, only to retreat before they reached the lowest step. Old women whispered that at dusk, when the trees rattled their skeletal branches against the stone, faint murmurs could be heard below ground, the echoes of family secrets too heavy to be silenced by soil. The vault had been built in haste after a fever epidemic swept through the estate generations earlier. Too many bodies, too little time, and too many questions about their origins. The Pembertons, always resistant to town scrutiny, buried their dead in a private frenzy, sealing names and dates into ledgers never seen by outsiders. Stone slabs bore no inscriptions. The dead were anonymous, stacked in niches like specimens, in a cold museum. On storm-lashed nights, when lightning clawed across the valley, the vault appeared alive. Witnesses described flashes illuminating figures lingering at its door, shadowy silhouettes, half-formed, some taller than any man, others bent and swaying as if carrying unseen burdens. Of course, no footprints were ever found in the mud afterward. The caretaker of the cemetery, an old man whose hands shook even in calm weather, refused to step within 30 paces of the crypt. He claimed the ground itself felt hollow, as though beneath the grass stretched a cavern deeper than the eye could measure. Stories multiplied over time. A milkmaid once swore she heard a child crying from within, her pail shaking so violently she spilled its contents. A vagrant passing through said he saw blue lantern light flicker from the cracks around the door. He left town the next morning, refusing food or coin, muttering only, "They are not buried, they are waiting." The most chilling account came from a Pemberton cousin, one of the few who dared keep his name. In a fever dream, he claimed to have walked barefoot into the vault, where the walls were not stone but flesh, ribbed and pulsing. The niches held not coffins but open eyes, dozens of them watching him, each reflecting his face but with lips curled into unfamiliar grins. He died days later, his body rigid, jaw locked around his own tongue. The family recorded the cause as convulsions. The town, however, whispered otherwise, and so the vault remained, not locked, but unopened. Not silent, but not explained. The Pembertons treated it as a necessary scar, never acknowledging its existence in daylight, yet ensuring flowers, always white lilies, never roses, were placed at its steps at the first thaw of spring. The gestures felt more like appeasement than remembrance, offerings to something beneath that had never truly died. It was, after all, a vault without names, and names had always been the Pembertons' most dangerous inheritance. If the vault was the family's wound, the portraits were its mask. The grand hall of the Pemberton estate was lined, floor to ceiling, with oil paintings that stared back at visitors in a silence heavier than any spoken curse. The oldest canvases had dulled into shadow, their pigments fading into the gloom, yet their eyes, always the eyes, remained disturbingly clear, glinting with an oily sheen no dust dared to settle on. Every generation had been painted, though rarely by the same hand. Some portraits bore the realism of masterful craft, others the crude haste of artists who worked with trembling brushes, but all shared one disquieting feature. None of the subjects smiled. Their mouths remained firmly shut, pressed into expressions of restraint or suspicion, as if revealing teeth might invite ruin. Town rumor suggested the family forbade any depiction of their smiles, fearing it would capture truths better left unshown. At night the portraits were worse. Servants whispered that no matter where they stood, the painted faces followed them, eyes cutting through the candlelight, some glittering with amusement, others brimming with rage. One chambermaid confessed she dreamt of drowning in those eyes, as though the paint itself melted into pools of ink that swallowed her lungs. She left the estate the next morning without collecting her wages. A traveling priest, invited once to bless the hall after a series of accidents, stood only briefly before the gallery. He refused to sprinkle holy water, muttering instead that the faces did not look painted but preserved. He could not be convinced to stay for supper, leaving the Pembertons to eat under the scrutiny of their own likenesses. The youngest portraits were perhaps the most unsettling. While earlier generations had been draped in dark silks and stately posture, the newer canvases portrayed children, solemn, pale, with hands folded as though in prayer. Yet the brushwork betrayed something stranger. Faint outlines of other figures lingered behind them, erased or painted over, shadows that did not belong. One could almost see the remnants of hidden siblings, blotted out as if their existence itself had been revoked. There were rumors, too, of portraits that had been removed. Spaces on the walls where frames once hung, now empty, their absence explained, away by fire or decay. But the truth slipped out in tavern gossip. Those missing portraits had not rotted but changed. A butler once swore he saw a painted figure turn its head overnight, shifting from profile to direct gaze. Another said one child's eyes had rolled upward until only the whites remained. To preserve appearances, the Pembertons took them down, crated them in the attic, and forbade discussion. Still, the gallery persisted, growing with each generation, a lineage of watchful silence. Visitors often remarked that the family resemblance was uncanny, even impossible. Cousins, centuries apart, bore the same jawlines, the same brows, the same unyielding eyes. It was as though time had recycled the same face, stamping it again and again onto new flesh. The town began to whisper what the family never admitted aloud, that the portraits did not depict likenesses at all. They captured essence, and essence, unlike paint, did not fade. The Pemberton mausoleum stood at the farthest edge of the estate grounds, where the land dipped toward a shallow ravine that often filled with fog thick enough to resemble a silver sea. Built of black marble and etched with curling ivy motifs, the mausoleum was less a place of rest and more a fortress of secrecy. Its iron doors, rusted and ornate, bore no names, only the crest of a raven clutching a key in its beak. Townsfolk whispered that no body ever left the mausoleum once interred, and some dared to suggest that not all who entered were truly dead. The oldest records spoke of family burials that defied both tradition and legality. Coffins sealed not with nails but with chains, bodies dressed in unfamiliar garments not of the century in which they had lived. One chilling detail recurred in multiple accounts. Each Pemberton was buried with a scrap of paper tucked inside their mouth. The content of these papers remained unknown, perhaps a secret name, perhaps a confession. No grave robber had dared to desecrate the mausoleum long enough to find out. By the 19th century, even the most skeptical locals avoided the place at dusk. They claimed to hear muted voices, as though the walls themselves murmured in languages no one could recognize. Some nights, heavy with mist, shadows flickered against the stone, shapes resembling elongated figures that swayed like pendulums, neither fully human nor fully phantom. The strangest tale involved a gravedigger who, in a drunken boast, swore he would pry open the mausoleum doors to reveal the truth of the Pembertons. His body was found the next morning at the ravine's edge, his jaw grotesquely dislocated as if forced open by unseen hands. Between his teeth was clenched a blank scrap of paper. After that, even the bravest men left the mausoleum undisturbed. Generations later, travelers continued to remark on its aura. Scholars who visited noted that the structure had no logical foundation. It appeared to stand unsupported on uneven ground, yet it never shifted nor cracked. The raven crest remained untarnished as though polished by invisible hands. The mausoleum did not decay, it endured. In many ways it was the truest monument to the family's legacy, cold, enduring, nameless, and impenetrable. Whatever secrets the Pembertons took to the grave were quite literally sealed behind iron and marble, leaving only whispers to haunt the town. The mausoleum was not just a tomb, it was a sentinel, an eternal reminder that silence and secrecy could outlast even death itself. Legends grew from silence, and nowhere was that truer than in the village tavern, where the lore of the Pembertons multiplied with each retelling. Farmers and fishermen would gather by the fire, their voices dropping when the conversation inevitably turned to the family that never spoke their true names. Each tale was more bizarre than the last, though none strayed too far from a chilling kernel of truth. One story claimed the Pembertons had struck a pact with an otherworldly being, a thing of shadow that demanded they keep their true identities hidden, lest it claim their souls. Another suggested that each Pemberton child was born with two names, the false one for the world to hear, and the real one, whispered once at birth, never to be spoken again. To utter it aloud would invite calamity, or perhaps a swift, unexplainable death. Children of the town dared one another to sneak onto the estate and listen by the windows. Some swore they heard the family speaking in low voices that seemed to echo twice, as if one voice belonged to the speaker and the other belonged to something else, something waiting in the shadows of their throats. Few of these children ever made the attempt twice. The townsfolk spoke of inexplicable tragedies that seemed to befall anyone who mocked or pryed too deeply into the Pembertons' affairs. A schoolteacher who ridiculed the silly superstition in class was later found, frozen stiff in her bed, though the night had been temperate. A merchant who boasted about profiting from the family's misfortunes lost his memory overnight, reduced to babbling nonsense for the rest of his life. The most enduring piece of lore, however, was the silent supper. According to gossip, the Pembertons hosted an annual feast where no words were exchanged. Plates clinked, goblets were raised, but not a syllable was spoken. The silence was so complete, the servants who attended claimed to hear the gnashing of teeth and the beating of hearts as clearly as thunder. They said the family communicated through glances, gestures, and something unspoken that passed between them like an electric current. These tales, of course, blurred the line between fear and fascination. For the villagers, the Pembertons were not merely reclusive aristocrats, but half-mythic figures, embodiments of the uncanny. The family's silence became its own language, one the town never fully understood but could never ignore. As decades passed, the stories multiplied into a labyrinth of contradictions. Some swore the Pembertons were cursed, others insisted they were blessed with forbidden knowledge. A few suggested they weren't entirely human at all. Yet through every version, one truth remained consistent. No one could recall ever hearing a Pemberton speak their own name. That, above all, was the detail that haunted the town, the silence of identity, the refusal of truth, the idea that the very essence of a person could be hidden forever. And if names carried power, as folklore often claimed, then the Pembertons had mastered the darkest power of all, the ability to erase themselves while still walking among the living. The 16th tale of the Pembertons begins in silence, an oppressive, unbroken quiet that crept over the estate like frost. The villagers first remarked upon it when the chimes of the great hall clock ceased, as though time itself had grown, weary of marking the family's hours. Soon after, the sound of carriages crunching up the gravel drive no longer echoed, and even the servants' footsteps fell softer, muffled by an unseen weight. The Pembertons, who once drew attention wherever they moved, became ghosts of their own domain. They no longer entered town, nor did they host their infamous candlelit suppers where whispers and wine flowed in equal measure. Windows that once flickered with firelight went dark, and the village children dared one another to count how many eyes still glimmered in that cavernous facade. Few could tally more than one or two before swearing they saw a curtain twitch or a pale silhouette watching from within. Rumors spread like mold. Had the family perished? Had they locked themselves away to practice unholy rites? A milkmaid claimed she heard weeping drift across the fields on a windless night, while the blacksmith swore he saw a lantern bobbing deep within the gardens, though no hand held it. Inside, life did not vanish, but rather congealed into something ritualistic, like a wound scabbing over. The Pembertons took to whispering in corridors, their words too faint to grasp, their conversations cut short if ever overheard. Meals grew sparse, taken not in the grand dining room but in private quarters where plates returned half-eaten, as though appetite itself had deserted them. The silence of the estate spread to its very bones. Floorboards no longer creaked. Doors opened without protest, as if even the house wished to keep its voice lowered. And then came the absence that no one could name, the absence of laughter. For all their cruelty and strangeness, the Pembertons once delighted in their eccentricities. Now, even their madness had gone mute. The village priest remarked that a house without laughter is worse than a tomb. For in a tomb, at least, the dead are at rest. Yet the Pembertons had not rested. In their shadowed rooms they practiced their rituals with renewed fervor, cutting their tongues upon secret oaths, burning the names they refused to speak into brittle parchment. They sought, it seemed, to erase themselves piece by piece from the world of the living. Those who passed too close to the estate swore they felt the hush press against their ears, a suffocating stillness that grew heavier the nearer one walked. Thus began the era known in town as the Great Quiet. It lasted for years, and none could say when it truly ended, for some swore it never did. The silence once born within the walls of the estate had seeped into the very earth, waiting for the day it would wake again. The 17th tale is marked not by silence, but by blood. It began with a storm, violent, sudden, as though the heavens themselves conspired to strip the estate bare. Lightning fractured the sky and illuminated the house in cruel white flashes, each revealing new terrors upon the windows, faces pressed too close, pale hands dragging down panes of glass, eyes that vanished when one dared to look longer. The storm raged for 3 nights, and on the 3rd morning the village awoke to the tolling of bells, though no church had rung them. By midday a messenger stumbled into town. His clothes were torn, his face streaked with rain and mud, but his voice carried a single unforgettable phrase: "The halls run red." The villagers, emboldened by curiosity and fear in equal measure, gathered at the edge of the Pemberton grounds. The storm had felled trees, scattered roof shingles, and clawed deep trenches in the gardens, but the house itself stood intact, if darker than ever. When a handful dared to cross the threshold, they found the messenger had spoken truth. Blood stained the floors in great sweeping arcs, as though dragged by unseen hands. It dripped from the banisters, spattered the portraits, and pooled beneath locked doors that no key would open. No bodies were found, at least not whole ones. A scrap of cloth here, a severed finger there, tokens of violence without a single corpse to claim them. The family was gone. Or so it seemed. For in one room, the great parlor, a message had been scrawled across the wall in a crimson hand. Its words were nearly illegible, twisted by the dripping of blood, but all who saw agreed it read, "We are not dead. We are underneath." Panic spread. Some claimed the Pembertons had sacrificed themselves in a grotesque ritual, binding their essence beneath the soil of their estate. Others whispered that the storm had been summoned, not endured, that the family had called down the lightning, as a curtain beneath which to vanish. Whatever the truth, none lingered in the house long enough to investigate. Yet the most chilling detail came not from within, but from without. The villagers who returned at dusk reported that the blood they had seen earlier was gone. The walls were bare, the floors clean, as if the storm itself had licked them dry. Only the faint smell of iron remained, clinging to the air like a warning. And so, the tale of the bloody storm took its place in the macabre annals of the Pembertons. Whether it marked their destruction or their transformation, None could say. But from that day forward, every storm that crossed the valley was met with locked shutters and whispered prayers, for fear the blood might flow again, and that this time it would not stop at the estate's threshold. The Pemberton crypt was unlike anything the town had ever seen. It was a subterranean cathedral of shadows, carved deep into the limestone beneath the estate grounds. Few had dared to enter, fewer still returned with words. The locals whispered that the air grew heavy the deeper one descended, as though each step lowered one not only into the earth but into the marrow of some monstrous being. Torches never seemed to burn properly there. Their light flickered as if smothered by an unseen breath. At the farthest chamber stood rows of sarcophagi, their lids engraved not with names but with symbols so intricate they seemed alive, coiling across the stone in twisting arcs. Each coffin was sealed with iron clasps, and yet the faintest murmurs, like prayers spoken in reverse, were said to seep from within. Visitors swore they heard weeping, others heard laughter. All agreed on one thing: the crypt was not a place for the living. The most haunting feature, however, was the so-called Hall of Faces. Dozens of marble busts lined the walls, but their visages were unfamiliar, not of the Pembertons nor of any townsfolk. Their eyes were carved with such precision they seemed to follow intruders, and their mouths, parted ever so slightly, whispered when the silence grew too deep. One historian suggested they were likenesses of the family's true names, rendered into stone so no one could ever speak them aloud. Another insisted they were effigies of those who had bargained with the Pembertons and lost, their souls bound in mineral forever. The crypt became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the foolish. Teenagers dared each other to descend, only to return pale and trembling, unable to describe what they had seen. On stormy nights, grave robbers tried to pry open the sarcophagi, but the iron clasps refused to break. One thief was found at dawn lying stiff upon the steps, his hands blackened as though burned from within, his lips sewn shut by some invisible thread. His companions fled the town that very day. For the family, the crypt was not only a resting place but a sanctum. Servants whispered of midnight processions led by candlelight, of chants echoing through the halls as the Pembertons gathered before the sarcophagi. No one knew whether they prayed, begged, or commanded, but the rituals always ended the same way: silence broken by a single scream, swallowed whole by the stone. And then, as though conjured from the depths, came the most enduring of all whispers. That one coffin in the deepest chamber was empty, waiting for the last of the bloodline. The stone lid bore no carvings, no symbol, no mark. Just a void, waiting for a name that no one dared to speak. The estate itself soon mirrored the crypt beneath. The once grand mansion began to rot from within, its halls sagging with damp and decay. Windows cracked like veins, walls swelled with mildew, and the great staircase groaned under the weight of invisible feet. Townsfolk noted that the house seemed to breathe. Its shutters fluttered on windless days. Its doors exhaled draughts colder than winter. Its very foundations hummed at night as though in communion with the earth below. The Pembertons themselves grew pale, their appearances fleeting, their conversations hushed. It was said they had become reflections of the estate, wearing faces that no longer belonged to them. Servants resigned one after another, citing nightmares that began the moment they crossed the threshold and refused to end after they left. Those who stayed too long either vanished or withered away, their features sunken, their voices hollow. Windows became the subject of fascination and dread. Locals swore they caught glimpses of figures standing in the highest rooms, tall silhouettes that dissolved when watched too long. Some claimed the glass panes themselves bore faces that were not there the day before, their expressions frozen in anguish. Once, during a lightning storm, the entire town saw the mansion flare to life with dozens of lights, every window aglow as though hosting a ball for guests unseen. Yet when morning came, the house was still in dark, the only movement a broken shutter tapping against the wall like a metronome. By then, no one knocked at the Pemberton door. Letters went unanswered. Debts were settled through intermediaries, who never revealed their employers' faces. The estate became both monument and warning, A Gothic sentinel at the edge of town, its windows watching, its halls murmuring, its crypt waiting. And still, the question lingered, pulsing through the town's veins like poison. What name would be carved at last into the empty coffin waiting in the bowels of the crypt? Beneath a moon swollen with pallid light, the final chapter of the Pemberton family unfolded with the hushed inevitability of a curse long spoken, long obeyed. The townspeople, those who had dared remain in the village despite generations of whispers and unease, gathered on the hill below the estate as if compelled by some unspoken summons. The house stood as it always had, tall and brooding, its gables cutting into the night like jagged teeth. But there was something different now, something final. The windows glowed faintly from within, not with fire but with the pale shimmer of figures moving room to room. The watchers had returned. Inside, the last living heir, Margaret Pemberton, frail and pale as parchment, sat alone in the great hall, a single candle guttering on the long, dust-laden table. Her family portraits loomed around her, their varnished, eyes bright with a cruel vitality. It was said the Pembertons had never spoken their true names aloud, hiding them in journals, sigils, and cryptic codes to cheat death itself. But Margaret knew the truth now. To conceal one's name was to fracture one's soul, to invite the house itself to carry the missing syllables in its walls. For centuries, the estate had whispered the names back in broken fragments, growing louder with each generation. Tonight, it shouted. The portraits began to stir, faint movements captured in the corner of the eye, a flicker of a smirk from Elias Pemberton, who had poisoned half his kin at a banquet, a tightening of the jaw from Lydia, whose cruelty toward her servants ended in their spectral rebellion. One by one they breathed into existence, stepping from canvas onto floorboards worn by centuries of their footsteps. Margaret did not scream. She only closed her eyes, as though she had waited for this moment her entire life. The house trembled with the sound of names, half-formed syllables in guttural tones, hissing vowels, consonants sharp as shattered glass. Each ancestor, spectral and towering, spoke the name they had never spoken in life. Voices joining in a dreadful choir that reverberated through the bones of the estate. With every name uttered, the house itself seemed to sag, its beams groaning, its windows cracking under the weight of revelation. Outside, the townspeople clutched each other in terror as the ground split at the foundations. The hill quaked. The great oak snapped like twigs, and a sound like 1,000 doors slamming echoed across the valley. Flames did not consume the house, nor did it crumble. Instead, it folded inward upon itself, collapsing not into rubble but into absence, a vanishing, as though the house had been unstitched from the fabric of the world. The air where it had stood rippled like disturbed water, then smoothed into nothing. When silence fell, all that remained was the scorched outline of the estate etched into the earth, a hollow impression of its terrible weight. The portraits, the halls, the whispers, all gone. Margaret's candle was the last light seen within, snuffed out as if swallowed whole. But in the village below, children born in the years that followed sometimes woke in the night with words on their lips, strange names unfamiliar and sharp-edged, spoken in voices not their own. Their parents hushed them back to sleep, though unease lingered. For if the house no longer stood, its memory still did. And memory, like a curse, does not vanish. The Pembertons had been erased, and yet they remained. The estate had disappeared, and yet the hill was never silent. And on certain nights, when the wind wound itself through the trees just so, the people swore they could hear the names, every one of them, drifting up from the scorched ground, spoken clear at last, free and terrible. The Pembertons were a family no one truly knew, because no one ever spoke their real names. Behind the stone walls of their Gothic estate lay secrets so dark they seemed to breathe through the windows at night.